Our second reading is from Jeremiah, chapter 17, verses 5 through 10. Thus says the Lord, cursed are those who trust in mere mortals and make mere flesh their strength, whose hearts turn away from the Lord. They shall be like a shrub in the desert and shall not see when relief comes. They shall live in the parched places of the wilderness, in an uninhabited salt land. Blessed are those who trust in the Lord, whose trust is the Lord. They shall be like a tree planted by water, sending out its roots by the stream. It shall not fear when heat comes, and its leaves shall stay green. In the year of drought it is not anxious, and it does not cease to bear fruit. The heart is devious above all else. It is perverse. Who can understand it? I, the Lord, test the mind and search the heart to give to all according to their ways, according to the fruit of their doings.
Hello. My name is Jesse. Hi, Jesse. I am 55 years old. I am a son. I am a husband. I am a father, and I am a pastor. I'm pretty good at dealing what's directly in front of me, but not always so good at addressing things that are outside my sphere of focus. I like good stories in any medium. I like books. I like music. I like movies. I like comics. Any good story is amazing. I love the outdoors. I like learning new things. I'm also an introvert. Now, that doesn't mean I'm shy. That doesn't mean that I'm antisocial. The only thing that means is that given the choice to draw energy from a group of people or draw energy from my own reserves, I choose the latter. Give me a pair of hiking boots, a kayak, and a hammock in a couple of days, and I am fine. I will be able to accomplish amazing things. Sometimes, one of the things that I like to do when I go out camping and such is I like to visit deserts. I am partial to high elevation deserts, kind of like central and eastern Oregon. I like going up to Modoc County here in California to visit the lava caves. And every now and then, I'll go down to southeastern California to Death Valley for a few days. Now, that place has a stark beauty that just amazes me. I appreciate how when you visit a desert like that, there's a lot of nothing. It kind of reminds me of some of the deserts that I visited when I was in seminary in the Middle East. And it seems like every living thing in the desert struggles to survive. And I guess it helps me appreciate living in a place where there's plenty, where you don't have to always think about surviving, that you can thrive. So this week we're on the fourth week of what has become an unintentional study on the prophets. We started out with Isaiah, and we went to Jeremiah and Amos, and then we kind of had a little detour into Nehemiah. And what we learned from that study thus far is that prophets were the traveling preachers of the day, and that prophecy is not fortune-telling. Prophecy is a word from God that helps us understand the past, evaluate the present, and avoid potential pitfalls in the future, especially when we turn away from God. We learned that the biggest difference between the prophets Isaiah and Jeremiah were their response to when God called them. Because Jeremiah, when called, said, "Hey, not me. I'm just a kid. I'm not your person." Whereas Isaiah, when God called Isaiah, he said, "Here I am, Lord. Send me." Now, the thing that they had in common was that God told both of them that their preaching would fall on deaf ears. So that's disappointing, I imagine, for them. But of the two prophets, the one that I appreciate the most is Jeremiah. And I think I appreciate him most because the core of his message can be found in chapter 32. God promises that even though Judah and Israel have turned their backs on God, they will be restored. And a new covenant will be established. And not a covenant that's written on stone or on scrolls or anything like that. This is a covenant that will be written on the people's hearts. So, the question I want to put on the table this morning is, what does wisdom look like? And how do we embed wisdom in the things that we say and do? The text that Bill read this morning was from Jeremiah, and it is from a section of Jeremiah that is dedicated to wisdom. And I also had him read Psalm 1 for our call to worship this morning, because it is clear that Jeremiah drew from the imagery of the psalm to communicate his message. Jeremiah gives us the image of a tree that has firm roots and weathers storms and that can draw from deep spiritual waters. And he sets that image against a tree that's planted in dry ground and struggles to survive. This is beautiful imagery, but it usually ends up being interpreted as, if you do good things, God will reward you, and if you do bad things, God will punish you, which leads to all sorts of unnecessary guilt and confusion, especially when you're going through trying times. And I recognize that anytime I challenge that interpretation, people get uncomfortable. They say, okay, Jesse, just pause for a moment. Listen to what you're saying. Are you trying to tell us that our actions don't matter? Are you trying to tell us that we can recklessly run willy-nilly all through life and just hope that things work out in the end? No, I'm not saying that, because clearly our actions do matter. Because when you're doing foolish things, the odds that something bad is going to happen dramatically increase, right? Same goes for when we make wise choices. The odds of reaping the benefits of making wise choices increases as well. But as we all know, there are plenty of examples of bad things that happen to wise people and good things that happen to foolish people. Is it fair? No, not really, but that's just the way life is, right? So, let's see if we can discover maybe another way of looking at these trees as they relate to wisdom and foolishness. Let's go back to that first psalm that he read, back to Psalm 1. This psalm is a classic vice and virtue list. That's what they call them, vice and virtue lists. And they're very common in the ancient Middle Eastern world. Because in a vice and virtue list, you have two columns. You have two lists. You have a blessed column and you have a cursed column. And Psalm 1 starts out with the good one. Or for the translation that he read, the happy are's. Happy are those who. Now, Jeremiah flips it around and starts out describing the cursed list. But both Jeremiah and the psalmist use the image of trees. The foolish are characterized as shrubs in the desert. Their hearts turn away from God, and thus they join the ranks of the clueless, right? In fact, they're so clueless that they can't even see help or opportunities for relief when they're presented to them right in front of their face. What is a shrub, though? Well, a shrub is a plant that is living in a land devoid of any other life. Jeremiah refers to it as an uninhabited salt land. So not only is there no life, but abundant life is not even possible. This shrub is alienated from everything. It's alone on its own island in the middle of a sea salt and nothingness. So contrast that with a tree. Now in this case, we have a tree that is planted by water. The roots of this tree will seek out water, and it will grow wherever the water grows. What happens when a tree is planted by water? It creates an entire ecosystem that is not only life-sustaining, it is life-giving. It flourishes. It provides fruit to sustain other things, other plants, other animals, even humans. And when the tree sheds its leaves, it turns into compost, and it fertilizes the ground around it and makes it possible for other life to exist. The shrub in the desert is isolated. The tree by the water stands in relationship to everything around it. Now the question that both the psalm writer and Jeremiah present is, what kind of tree are you? And what kind of impact does that have on your life? Is your life isolating you? Is your life shutting you off from relationships? Is your life propping up your own survival while leeching off all the other nutrients around it? Or is it one that is life-giving and life-sharing and bearing fruit that's not just for your own benefit, but for the benefit of all those around? And while we're at it, let's talk about what it means to bear fruit. Sometimes we think of bearing fruit only in terms of church growth. People think that bearing fruit means going out and getting more people to come to church so that our report to the denomination at the end of the year looks really good. You know, yay, let's prop up the institution. Or we can think at it in other terms, because it's bigger than that. Church growth, as far as numbers is concerned, is a byproduct of being faithful and bearing the kind of fruit that multiplies justice and mercy and humbleness and kindness and faith and hope and love and all those other things that you see on the blessed side of the vice and virtue columns in the Bible. Bearing fruit means knowing God's kingdom in a much more holistic way. So in our individual lives and in the life of our church, we need to ask this question. Are we dried up shrubs, or are we fruit-bearing trees? Are we pulling from the community, or are we giving back to the community? Are we going to act foolishly and cut ourselves off from opportunities to flourish and grow? Or are we going to act wisely and be nourished to flourish? Like I said earlier, this notion can be used to prop up the idea that when you do good, you'll be blessed, and when you do bad, you'll be cursed. Now, some churches take it a little step further and say, if you have faith, you will be blessed with material wealth and prosperity. But if you don't have enough faith, you're going to lose out and you're going to be poor and destitute. Now that's called the prosperity gospel, and it has been infecting and crippling the ministry of the church off and on for centuries. So let's look at this illustration of the two trees in a different light, though. Let's look at it as an invitation to examine our hearts. Jeremiah says that the heart can be devious. It was true 2,700 years ago when Jeremiah wrote this, and it is true today. We humans are great at justifying the ways that we use to not be faithful or generous or kind or loving. So much of the ministry that we see is it gets messed up because of the devious heart of ours. Because who really knows what's in the heart? God knows. Guess who doesn't know? We don't. We don't. We don't get to make that call. We don't get to judge and choose who is blessed and who is cursed. We don't get to look at someone who's homeless and say, well, it's pretty clear that that person isn't blessed. And the flip side of that is we don't get to look at someone who drives around in a fancy car and lives in a fancy house and wears fancy shoes and say, well, of course that person's blessed. Just look at him. We don't get to say that. We don't get to make that call. That is for God to determine. That's why I think this passage is an invitation. It's an invitation to introspection. Know thyself, follower of God. Examine where your trust lies. God knows who we are, not who we pretend to be. Dutch theologian Henry Nouwen, or is it Henry Nouwen? Henry Nouwen. It's spelled with an I. He once wrote, "You are not what you have. You are not what you do." Great quote. You are not what other people say about you. You are not fully encapsulated by your best moment or your worst moment. You are, however, a beloved child of God, and God knows you intimately. It is all that you are. And everything you do to try to convince yourself that you are either better or worse than that is idolatrous. It's blasphemous even. This is Jeremiah's invitation to come home. This is our invitation to come home. Another thing I often say that makes people squirm is when I say Jesus should irritate us. And I'll admit that maybe sometimes I say that a little more bluntly than I should, like I did on Bible study on Thursday night, but I stand by it because it happens to people who follow Jesus all the time. Jesus calls us to do things that we do not like to do. And he calls us to love people who are difficult to love. I know he drags me kicking and screaming into situations where I'd rather just walk by completely. But what I sometimes forget to mention is that in addition to exasperating us, Jesus works very hard to renew and transform our hearts. Maybe I should just say that Jesus afflicts the comfortable, but he also comforts the afflicted. Create in us clean hearts, O God, and renew a steadfast spirit within us. Help us to be like a tree who is planted by living waters and draws from those living waters to bear God's fruit.